Hello there, survivors. I'm Sir Oliver Drap, Knight to Her Majesty Queen Bishop of New Boston. I've come to talk to you about storytelling. As per the Queen's ambition, the Knight Corps finds it important that we as a species remain creative and tell new stories to help preserve one of the most critical things about humanity. That, of course, is art. Our ability to create art has helped separate us from the beasts of the world for tens of thousands of years, and it would be a shame if that were to come to an end because of this wasteland we find ourselves living in. So, in the spirit of discovering our inner voices, I want to talk to you about 3 key details that any good story needs in order for it to make sense. In this transmission, I will tell you about what I think is the first and most important element: world building. The world in which your story exists is very important to establish. It helps the audience understand certain rules in the universe, which will help dictate the stakes of your story whenever your characters make decisions. These character actions must abide by the rules set forth in the setting. In order to help the audience understand this, the writers need to come up with creative avenues to fill in the missing knowledge without flat out telling you. What do I mean by this? Imagine sitting down to watch the first episode of a brand new show, and the entire episode is just a camera that pans over the world, moving from scene to scene with no dialogue, and in the last second, it focuses on our main character for the first time before cutting to credits. Now, to be fair, I wouldn't dismiss this as a bad approach altogether. I would think it would work best in a fantasy world because it would allow you to show off exotic new settings, the various occupations that citizens do as the camera swings past, and the different types of wildlife and creatures you've created in your macrocosm. Now try and take that and stretch it into half an hour, or an hour-long episode even, and there is a good chance that you will lose a significantly large portion of the audience before you even engage with the story. It's usually why something like this would be condensed down to a minute of screen time at most in order to pique the interest of your audience without action or violence being added in. The goal is to balance the information about world building with character development and plot. Usually what most writers do is that they have a character learning about the world as they progress through the story, sprinkling in details throughout as the characters perform their day-to-day routine. Some will introduce the world by telling a tale based on recent history or ancient mythology that is relevant to the present day.
It began with the forging of the Great Rings.
Other writers will give you a quick summary or narration detailing the state of the world before launching you into the action. Now, even amongst the ruins around you, I'm sure you've still heard of the greatest world builder that has ever lived, and his realm of Middle-earth. Yes, I am speaking of the great J.R.R. Tolkien, a writer who spent countless years fleshing out his world, even to the point of creating his own languages. It's quite an impressive feat, and Tolkien has created a story that has had very little competition in terms of how thorough and consistent his world is. That being said, I can understand if you don't have countless years to build your story, so let's try to figure out the most important aspects to world building. The first thing we should talk about is what kind of world you want to establish. Is it a fantasy realm where you have total control over all the rules, including physics? Or is your world more grounded, being very similar to Earth? The fantasy realm has the most creative freedom, in which you can dictate anything and everything however you choose. The Lord of the Rings benefits greatly from this. Aside from basic physics and general topography, everything else in the world is made up. This includes things like wizards, elves, dwarves, hobbits, orcs, dragons, and magic. Every component helps Tolkien explain how unique his world is compared to our own. When we look into a more realistic world, however, more research is required to tell an understandable and believable tale. Science fiction also requires this because the science involved typically will have its roots in modern technology. But that research may not necessarily transfer directly to your writing either. This research is primarily meant to help you understand things like physics, certain historical events, political or economic struggles, etc., advancements in our technology, how certain cultures function, our native wildlife, all these things will need to be accounted for to some degree. A good example of a property that explores a more grounded approach would be The Last of Us.
You don't get to rush this.
No, not that one. The good one. It is a very pragmatic take on a world that follows the collapse of civilization, caused by an outbreak of zombies that were created by a real-life fungus that is found in nature. The major difference is that in this world, the fungus is able to infect the human body and causes people to turn into this crusty, zombie-like creature. The longer that creature lives underground and out of sunlight, the larger and more grotesque it gets, much like real fungi that thrive under similar conditions. Everything else inside the world is much like our own. Old cities in ruins, healthy plant life everywhere, rifles, ammunition, food production, etc. What's nice about a world that tries to remain extremely realistic is that there is less of a need to lore dump all of the aspects of this fictional world to the audience because we know how things operate on Earth for the most part. It's when we introduce key new details that are radically different or intriguing that this becomes relevant. The cordyceps fungus from The Last of Us that I mentioned earlier is one such example. Another example would be Jurassic Park. We understand the world's rules, and we know that it takes place off the coast of Costa Rica. The major difference is that we have been able to clone and repair DNA from fossilized blood samples in order to create dinosaurs.
Bingo. Dino DNA.
The technological marvel that allowed for this creation is the only new piece in the world, whereas the park itself uses technology that we understand in the real world. Supercomputers, programmers, electric fencing, moats, electric cars. Everything remains consistent within what we know, and the things that are new are addressed when necessary. Aside from that, the most important aspect to world building is to establish the setting of each scene, specifically your character's locations. Does it take place in a desert? Or in a major city? Is there a lonely cabin in the woods? Your setting will need to be discussed or shown in order for the audience to know where your story takes place. This is another part of the process where your research will become important. You will need to learn about the location you want to establish to help it feel more believable, or more accurate to its real-world counterpart. This is an area where fantasy worlds have more freedom, because for the most part, you aren't locked into keeping things the same, nor are you bound to real life's rules. Sure, you could say your fantasy world has large oak tree forests, but what if instead it was populated by giant hairy spider leg looking plants, and that if you touched one, the hair would transfer a toxin that would put you to sleep, allowing the local wildlife to consume your sleeping body? Yeah, bet you're glad I put that image into your head now. You could do a lot of interesting things in a fantasy world, however that's when the writer must address the differences in the story. What makes things like that difficult is that most of your characters living in that fantasy world should know a majority of these things, but you have to be able to tell the audience without your character breaking the fourth wall to explain that. I also say majority because it is fair to assume they don't know everything unless they are some kind of god or live for thousands of years. This is why you find in most stories that the main character is usually someone who has had an extremely sheltered life, and that this story is the first time they are exploring the world. By doing it this way, the audience learns something new about the world at the same time the main character is, which can help the audience feel more immersed as if they are with the protagonist in the story instead of just reading or watching. Allow me to reference Tolkien again by presenting you with Frodo from Lord of the Rings. He has lived a quiet life in the Shire, only hearing about the outside world from Bilbo and his stories traveling with the dwarves.
Of three monstrous trolls, and they were all arguing amongst themselves about how they were going to cook us.
When he goes out on his own journey, the other characters will tell him who people are, the locations that they visit, the dangers of certain areas, etc., all while feeling overwhelmed by the burden placed upon him and his friends. But what happens if you deviate from the world's rules? Well, you get what is called a continuity error. A continuity error is when your story purposefully breaks the rules of your world building in order to progress. This can be done in both small and large ways, with the massive problems breaking your world on a fundamental level. This is where consistency becomes important. For instance, If you introduce a virus to your protagonist halfway through a realistic story, but establish first that the main character lived in a sterile environment their entire life, and has been living outside of that sterile environment for a set period of time without getting sick, this breaks the rules established in your own grounded world. Someone who has lived a sterile life for so long would not have a strong immune system like the rest of us would. In fact, it would be more likely that the protagonist would get sick within a week from the common cold because their body cannot handle many types of diseases. That virus halfway through the story now makes us question why the character didn't get sick at the beginning. So what's a way around this? You would have to explain to the audience in some way that even though the character remained in a sterile environment, they had also been given vaccinations and supplements in order to maintain a strong immune system. Or the lazy way would be never bring up anything relating to viruses or immune health at all, and drop that section of your story entirely. What's another example of a continuity error? Glad you asked. Well, how about the Holdo maneuver from The Last Jedi? This is considered an error from a world-building perspective because despite the fact that it's the 8th installment of the series, we are only now seeing that hyperdrives are absolutely a viable weapon, even though that prior to this film, there were 2 other wars that were fought across the galaxy where this was never used. What makes this a major problem is that it is something that was never addressed properly. From the earliest installment, it was said to be possible.
Traveling through hyperspace ain't like dust and crops, boy. Without precise calculations, we'd fly right through a star or bounce too close to a supernova and that'd end your trip real quick, wouldn't it?
But nobody was ever shown to use it because of the damage it would cause to the stakes of our story. Which, if you remember from episode 4, will the good guys be able to destroy the planet-destroying laser space station threatening the galaxy? With the hyperdrive kamikaze, the answer from the get-go would have been yes, because a single fighter could have done the job and there would have been no conflict. This maneuver ruins stakes in space battles. But then again, that movie is broken on just about every fundamental level conceivable, so let's just stay as far away from it as we can from now on. So, if you want to introduce a new world to your audience, how would you do that? I would recommend a quick summary of the immediate surroundings of our protagonist. After that, go through how people are interacting with their environment, and mix that in with the character development and plot as the story progresses. This form of show don't tell helps when talking about world building because it allows you to share details through how someone else operates in their life. The biggest thing to keep in mind with your world building is that once you establish your rules, you are now bound to them for the rest of your story. If left is right, then left is right, no matter what. This restriction is very important for the stakes of the tale. Otherwise, nobody can feel invested in our protagonist's plight. This is where the good writers shine above the amateurs. By consistently imposing these restrictions, a good writer could come up with creative and logical ways to tell the story that keeps the conflict engaging as well as makes sense. So, to summarize, world building consists of your setting as well as the laws that your world operates in. The more realistic it is, the more research you should put in to make it as accurate as possible. Your story must be able to function inside of this setting, as well as let the audience know what they are looking at. The more complex your world is, the more explanation will be required in order for audiences to understand what is happening. But be careful to not constantly dump information onto your audience. Blend in these details with your character development as the plot progresses. If you break the laws set by your world, then you also shatter the consistency of your realm, which will then ruin any investment your audience may have had in your story. I would suggest starting with an outline of all your world details first, and then start fleshing out those before starting your story. I hope that this has been helpful in your creative endeavors to tell your own amazing story. Keep humanity's greatest treasure alive, and stay safe out there in the wastes. If you are interested in keeping in touch, come join my Discord. There we talk about many things such as favorite movies, books, general day-to-day activities, you name it. Maybe you can make some new friends. Who knows? In a time where humanity is on the edge of extinction, it's important now more than ever to remain in contact. The link is in the description. Also, please let me know what you think in the comments. I would genuinely appreciate any and all feedback, as it will help improve my work. I would like to take this time to thank Victor Shep for editing my script, as his input has helped a great deal with compiling the transmission you are now watching. Go and check out his videos, as I'm sure you'll get a good laugh out of them. I would also like to thank Gothic Crusader for helping with the audio, as well as Guardian Fortress and Jubilee for the support and suggestions. The links to their channels are also in the description. I will be looking forward to seeing you in the next 2 parts, where I will discuss character development and plot. This is Sir Oliver Drab, signing off. Over and out.